Jesus said, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. Who told somebody about Jesus this week? Yes, sir. Okay. All right. Somebody else. Tell somebody about Jesus this week. We had several conversations this week with folk, and it's always delightful to do that. Okay?
We had a unique experience yesterday. I had my family reunion and I invited a friend, and my cousin's girlfriend came. She was from Germany and she felt totally out of place. And my friend came and started speaking German with her. And she asked her, and the girl said she's not a Christian. And she asked Bernadette if she was, and she said yes. And she was sharing with her through the German.
Wow.
So,
Right here in
our fellowship hall.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So she's starting that conversation too.
Started? Yeah, that's awesome. I guess that's what the balloons were about.
Yeah.
I saw those
We
out
forgot
front.
those.
Yeah.
Forgot the balloon.
Okay, wonderful. And if you didn't tell somebody about Jesus, did you try? Okay, that's an old me moment, I'm sure. But who's on time reading your Bible through this year? Way to go. Wow. Wow. A bunch of you. That's wonderful. On our schedule, we came across the answers to these 3 trivia questions. We'll deal with the Old Testament first. The first king of Israel was Saul, son of Kish. To which of the 12 tribes of Israel did he belong? A little obscure with this one. It was the tribe of Benjamin that Saul and his dad belonged to. All right? David determined that he would bring the ark of God up from Abinadab's house to Jerusalem. On the way, the oxen, which was pulling a cart carrying the ark, stumbled. A man named Uzzah put out his hand to steady the ark, and God struck him dead.
Yes.
Why?
Because no man was supposed to,
Wasn't supposed to touch it.
wasn't supposed to touch the ark.
Okay. And the ark was, the instructions that God gave Moses was that the ark had been fitted with rings on all 4 corners, through which long poles would be inserted so that it could be carried on the shoulder of the priests. That was the job of the priests, to carry the ark rather than to put it on a cart and haul it around. So,
did you ever think how they get it on the cart?
Yeah, that's a really good question. How'd they get it on?
Just on a little monkey wrench.
I know.
All those poles were laminated with gold.
They were covered with gold. As a matter of fact, at the inauguration of Solomon's temple, it was said that those poles stuck out of the curtain from the Holy of Holies into the holy place and could be seen. The poles could be seen. So that was an interesting point of trivia there. In the New Testament, according to John chapter 5, verse 2, we'll get to that one a little later on in our study of John. Inside the city, near the sheep gate, was the pool of Bethesda with 5 covered porches. Crowds of sick people, blind, lame, and paralyzed, lay on the porches. One of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him and knew that he had been ill for a long time, he asked him, "Would you like to get well?" What a great question for somebody that's sick. And what did the man answer him?
I've got the water to get me in the water.
Yeah, he says, I can't get well. Because when the angel comes and disturbs the water, the first one in gets healed, and I can't get there quick enough because I don't have anybody to help me. And Jesus did what?
Healed.
He healed him. Yeah. But isn't that a great question? One of the things that keeps people from getting well is sometimes they're not ready to get well. The addict, the alcoholic, someone holding a resentment, not ready to let it go yet. Okay? Do you want to get well? If you do, I hope you'll interest yourself in Celebrate Recovery, which is coming up. We're going to start our training on July the 11th. If you'd like to learn more about it, I have some pamphlets here, courtesy of Bob, that describe the program and give you further information. And courtesy of Danette. I'm sorry. You were the messenger. Okay. All right. So we have some packets here of information. If you'd like one, please do pick it up and learn more about how to help people that are hurting. Oh, and maybe how to help yourself. Okay? Now, let's get into the lesson. We're going to be reading verses, John chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. I'm kind of wanting to get on through the end of the chapter because you know what comes up after chapter 2. John chapter 3, where there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus. I can't wait to get to that one. That's evangelical holy ground right there. Okay, so but we're gonna take it in order, and next week we'll be discussing why Jesus didn't trust himself to the people around him at this particular time. So we're going to look at zeal for my Father's house. John chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. So after this, he, that would be Jesus, went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brethren and his disciples, and they continued there not many days. And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went to Jerusalem and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the money changers' money, and overthrew the tables. And he said to them that sold doves, take these things hence, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, the zeal of thine house has eaten me up. Now you'll remember, just last week we talked about the miracle that Jesus did at the wedding in Cana. Cana, 9 miles north of Nazareth, so it's very likely everybody knew everybody in that locale. So it was a gathering for joy. And when Jesus did his first miracle, the poet Alexander Pope said that the conscious water saw its master and blushed. Neat thought. Anyway, the miracle was among family and friends. It was very subdued. There were no angels blowing horns. There was no neon sign in the sky. There was no herald making an announcement that it was going to happen. Very low key, and it was in a setting, he did his first miracle in a setting of joy. That was interesting. That was his first sign. That was the first recorded sign that he's beginning his messianic ministry. And now here is the second one that's recorded. Now this one is not a setting of joy. This one is a setting of worship, where he does his second sign. And to remind you that John has two objectives in his writing of this gospel. The first one is apologetic. And again, you can see this in chapter 20, verse 31, where it says, "These things have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God." And the second objective is evangelistic. You want to finish the verse, and it says, "And that believing you might have life in his name." So apologetic and evangelistic. And here we're looking at this text where we see him exerting his divine authority, and we're going to look at what causes Jesus to do what he does here, and it has to do with corrupted worship, apathetic worship, insincere worship, and corruption that surrounded all of that. We're reminded of what Isaiah said back when in Isaiah 1, what are your multiplied sacrifices to me, the Lord says. He wants obedience rather than sacrifice. It is recorded by Josephus that at this time, the time of Jesus, that on a typical Passover in Jerusalem, there would be 250,000 sheep slaughtered for sacrifice. 250,000. He also writes that if you assume that the extended family that would have the meal from that particular lamb or sheep would number 10 people, then that was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500,000 people that might be in the city for Passover. Wow. Now, let's say it's conservative that there's 1 million. In a town that is normally 1 to 300,000 people, that's a lot of folks in that city. And you can imagine that every available room to be rented or used for habitation was occupied. So that it was a crowded time. It was a time of remembering the miracle that God did. You remember what Passover is all about. Back in Exodus, it's described as God was about to do his last plague, or send his last plague on the people of Egypt, so that the Pharaoh would let the people go. Actually, they kind of thrust them out after this one. But he was going to send the death angel to take the firstborn of every family in the land, except if the children of Israel, if the Jews would slaughter the lamb in accordance with what Moses told them, and take some of the blood and put it on the lintel and the doorpost, then the death angel would see that and would pass over that house. Okay, that's the genesis of this feast of Passover. It was observed every year, and we can assume that Jesus, from the time he was 8 days old, when he was taken to the temple the first time, that his family, being observant Jews, would have taken him back every year after that. We do have a snippet in the gospel that shows him there in the temple at age 12. He's asking the leaders there, the teachers there, good questions, by the way. That's one way of teaching, is asking good questions. So it's very likely that Jesus was there in Jerusalem every year at Passover time. So what makes this year different? Where he comes in and he cleanses the temple. He's not done it. He's 30 years old, and he's probably been there and observed this behavior over and over again. But this time it's different. Why is that? Ah, yes. He's beginning his ministry. He is establishing his authority as the Messiah. And we'll get into that both this week and next week. But why does Jesus do what he does? He sees his Father being insulted. He sees the sanctity of holy worship being corrupted. And he releases his fury on the people. Isaiah says, I've had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed cattle. I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to appear before me, who requires of you this trampling of my courts? Wow, it's as if Isaiah is watching what's going on down 800 years later in the temple court. He says, bring your worthless offerings no longer. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity and the solemn assembly. Cannot endure. That's what Jesus got to the point. I cannot endure it. By the way, I think we see also here a foreshadowing of judgment to come. When he comes again, there will be judgment that takes place. Amos tells us to stop your songs. I don't want to hear them anymore. The Lord is not interested in worship by rote. He's not interested in worship without connection. He wants us to worship him in spirit and in truth. Yes. Jesus is just left Cana. He's gone up to Capernaum, and ultimately Capernaum becomes his home base. And later on, and he must have done just miracle after miracle in Capernaum, because in Matthew 11, Jesus says that if the miracles that had been done in Capernaum had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented. Wow. So judgment is coming on those people that lived in Capernaum for not recognizing him as the Messiah. So we get the Passover is about to happen. Jesus is in Capernaum, and he decides that he's, as he has probably every year of his life, goes down to Jerusalem to be a part of Passover. It's interesting that Jesus attends this one and the next three Passovers. His ministry begins at Passover, and it ends at Passover. It ends with him becoming the Passover lamb. So this one and then 3 more, and his ministry on earth in his physical body will end. So he comes to,
I don't agree with that statement.
okay, well, in a resurrected body, okay, he had 40 days here in his resurrected body. Is that what you're talking about?
Jesus is going on right now. And he is here.
Well, let's put it this way, in his unresurrected human body. How about that? All right? Because he now is what we shall be. We don't know what we shall be, Paul says, but when we see him, we shall be like him. We're going to have a body like his. It's not like this body. It's going to be like his. Okay? So he comes to Jerusalem, and verse 14, and he found in the temple, and by the way, this is in the court of the temple. It's based on the word that's used here. Very likely the Gentiles' court. This speaks of the bigotry of the Jews. They didn't have this going on in the men's court or the women's court for the Jews. This bazaar is called the Bazaar of Annas, who was the high priest. This merchandising, this corruption was taking place in the Gentiles' court, where the Gentiles were supposed to be able to come and worship. How many of you know it's hard to worship in the middle of a store? Or a flea market? It's probably more like the setting here. And so, again, the Jews look down on the Gentiles, and this is another evidence of their snobbery toward the Gentiles, is that this bazaar was set up in the Gentiles' court.
I think they still do.
Oh, it's not limited to them. A lot of folks in our churches today, I was with some folks earlier this week that were talking about folks of a different race in a derogatory term. We still do it today. We still do it today. And I think it still offends the sensitivities of God just as much now as it did then. So they were selling oxen, sheep, and doves, and they were exchanging money. Now let me try to set this up without spending too much time on it. You had, as we mentioned, maybe 1 million or more people in the city at that point from all over the world came to Jerusalem for Passover. Now, some from great distances didn't do it every year, but some were there, and they knew that bringing an ox or a lamb a great distance would be an undue burden to their travel. So they knew that when they arrived, there would be a source for them to buy an animal to be sacrificed for Passover. There's some evidence that they also knew that if they did bring their own lamb, that it had to be inspected and approved by the local priest there. And they would expect it not to be. So they would then have to buy one. Okay? So that was a part of the corruption that was taking place, where worship was supposed to be happening. Then, if you couldn't afford a lamb, you could sacrifice 2 turtle doves. Okay, that's why the doves were a part of that.
Was it wrong? Is it wrong for them to purchase their sacrifice? I mean, if they didn't have one?
No.
That wasn't wrong, it was where they were doing it.
It was
in
the
temple,
locale.
in the location.
It was the locale and the process. Where
Money making.
it was follow the money. Follow the money. Okay?
Sounds like Christmas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Follow the money. Yeah. So that was why they were selling the ox, the sheep, and the doves. But the locale and the process were what made it offensive. The money changers. If you were going to buy a lamb there in the temple court, the transaction had to be done in the temple shekel. If you were going to make a donation to the temple or pay your temple tax, it had to be done in the temple shekel. So if you're coming from Mesopotamia, or you're coming out of Egypt, or you're coming from Persia, you would have to have your money exchanged into the temple shekel in order to buy the lamb, in order to pay your temple tax.
And
So
they charged an extra fee.
They charged an extra fee, and it was thought that it was somewhere around 10 to 12% or more. I remember being in the old city of Jerusalem back in 1976, and I was haggling with this guy over a roll of film that I was trying to buy. And he started here, and I started here, and we finally met in the middle, and I walked away thinking, hey, I got a good deal on the film, until I got to working on the exchange rate and realized I'd paid $60 for a roll of film in 1976. He got me. He got me.
They've been doing it for thousands.
They've been doing it for thousands. They've had a little practice, haven't they? So, the animals, the merchandising of the animals in a place where worship was supposed to be taking place. As a matter of fact, that's as close as the Gentiles could get into the temple. That was as close to God, or their representation of God and God's house, as they could get, and it becomes a bazaar. And it just, when Jesus gets there, he introduces himself as one with authority on behalf of God. And some say that this was a miracle in itself, because there were probably tens of thousands of people in that courtyard at any given time. Jesus comes in and he is angry, but he takes the time to sit down and plait together out of cords. By the way, there would be cords everywhere because of leading animals in, tying up packages or cages. That'd be everywhere. So he picks them up off the ground, plaited them together, and think about this. This is not a very dangerous weapon. This is a whip, maybe 5-6 feet long. And with that whip, he drives all of the animals out of the courtyard and instructs the folks with the doves. He didn't want to turn them loose. Get those things out of here. And then he walks over to the money changer's table, flips it over, coins go bouncing everywhere. If you've ever been on the Temple Mount, you know that it's a stone pavement. And I'm sure you could hear those coins bouncing around, going everywhere. And these guys' eyes getting big, thinking, how am I ever going to get those? And here's this guy with his whip. So he turns the table of the money changers, and their money goes everywhere. And then he points to the doves and says to the folks that had them, take those things out of here. You're making my Father's house a house of merchandise. And that's not the purpose of the house of God. What is the purpose of the house of God? Worship. It's a place of prayer. It's a place of worship. And this was the central, yeah, Hugh?
You know, they wouldn't know this if they hadn't studied what the prophets did and what the scrolls had told them. And worship God in truth.
Yes.
It's important that you study the Word.
Yep. We know the Word, so we know what the truth is.
That's right. And I don't want to throw no rocks at this generation, but they didn't realize that was the sacrifice that drove them out of there. That would sacrifice earth sacrifice today.
Right.
Well, what's the forever?
Right. Right. I was reading one commentator who said Jesus drove the offenders out of the temple. He has never driven anybody into the temple. If we're to come into the temple, into the presence of God, it's by invitation.
Amen.
We're never forced. Forced conversions happen all the time in other religions, but never in ours.
Well, if it's forced, it's meaningless.
If it's forced, it's meaningless. That's right. So, now, there was a temple guard. There were as many as 300 guards there to keep down any difficulty. And there have been difficulties before. As a matter of fact, in the time of Jesus, during his lifetime, there had been a high priest that the folks didn't like. And one day he appeared, and it had been prearranged that all the people in the court began to throw lemons at him. I don't know what they thought about the significance of lemons, but that's what they were doing. And the temple guards came out and killed over 1,000 of those in the courtyard. So the temple guard is there, and if you've ever been there, if you're looking west toward, on the Temple Mount, toward the Wailing Wall, which is down below, you'll see over to the right a structure that was called the Fortress of Antonia. The fortress had the Roman contingent of soldiers there, and if they saw any disturbance happening, they would have brought their garrison down to put it down, as they did when Paul was there speaking and there was an insurrection. But they didn't. I wonder, this is, just a crazy side of me. I wonder, they're watching this thing take place as Jesus is running around with this whip, driving the merchandisers out of the temple. I wonder if they're sitting there on the wall, looking down where they could see what was going on in the courtyard and thinking, look at that. You ever seen anything like this before? Here, this guy's whipping the religious leaders. Now, there's no indication that he harmed anybody. None. There may have been a bruised knee, or where somebody stumbled over the money changer's table that had been upset, or bumped into a sheep or something, but there's no indication that he actually harmed anybody. But you got to wonder what those Roman soldiers were thinking as they were watching this thing take place. So it's a miracle in the sense that nobody intervened. Nobody. Not the temple guards, not the Roman soldiers.
It's sort of like the when Jesus walked through the crowd before his time was, when they were trying to stone him and seize him.
He just
Walked through.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like,
Thanks for the setup.
A miracle. Yeah.
Thanks for the setup. There was a time when Jesus had declared himself to be the Messiah that a crowd decided they wanted to stone him to death. And they grabbed him and took him, and they were about to stone him, and he just walked away from them. Probably a miraculous event there as well. But here, he's the one dealing out the punishment, and everybody else scatters. So, interesting dynamic there. He said, "You've turned my Father's house into a house of merchandise." Nothing enraged the holy anger and fury like irreverence. Woo, let's be careful, folks. We are here to study His Word, and in a few moments we're going to be worshiping. And worship is not sitting back looking at the choir and the preacher saying, "Bless me if you can." It is that God is the audience. We are the actors on the stage. We are to worship Him. Okay? So let's get that part right. And understand that apathetic worship is not becoming of a Christian. The Jews expected the Messiah to come and attack the Romans and drive them out of the country. But when He gets there, what does He do? He attacks them and drives them out of the courtyard. What a turn of events. It's the reverse of what they expected. And by the way, sometimes we have our expectations all screwed up too, don't we? When we expect God to behave in a certain way, and when He doesn't, we seem to be discouraged or mystified, when we ought to just say, "Thy will be done. Thy will be done." Here we see a preview of the power of the Almighty God, who's going to come and execute judgment on those that don't worship Him in spirit and in truth.
Amen.
Okay? We don't want to be a part of that. He is always loyal to His Father, and when He sees His Father being mocked, He becomes enraged. If there's something within you that when you see the Father being mocked, something ugly balls up in you, that's a good sign. That's a good sign. So here, verse 17. Let's wrap it up. Verse 17, it says, "And His disciples remembered that it was written, the zeal of thine house has eaten me up." That's a reference to Psalm 69:9. And it was the prophecy about the coming Messiah, the zeal for the house of God, the presence of God. has actuated him. It's brought him to take dramatic action, and nobody stopped him. Next week we're going to examine the priest's response to this, and it's the question is, wow, who gave you the authority to do this? Think about that, and we'll study that next week. Okay, let's close with that.